This episode of Trifles is made possible by listeners like you who support us on Patreon and Substack. To learn more, go to patreon.com/trifles or trifles.substack.com.
Welcome to Trifles, a weekly podcast about the Sherlock Holmes stories.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Yes, the box was cardboard, the detective was dying, and the bridge was Thor, but there are so many other details to pick apart in the stories.
Pray, be precise as to details.
Have you ever stopped to wonder why James Phillimore disappeared looking for his umbrella? Or just how parsley can manage to sink into the butter?
You are very inquisitive, Mr. Holmes.
It is my business to know what other people don't know.
Scott Monty and Bert Wolder will have the answers to these questions and more in Trifles.
The game's afoot.
Episode 415, Battlestations. Hello and welcome to Trifles, the Sherlock Holmes podcast where we get into the details in the Sherlock Holmes stories. I'm Scott Monty.
I'm Bert Wolder.
And Bert, are you manning your battle station?
I am. The red light has gone off and Sulu has raised the shields. I don't know quite what's going on.
Oh, that's excellent.
Dive.
Well, this should be an interesting episode. We thought we might go through the canon and see what battles are mentioned, either specifically by name or by inference. This took a little bit of work, and we turned to the hive mind community in the Strangers Room on Facebook. So we appreciate our fellow Sherlockian support in identifying some of these battles, but it should be an interesting military thought exercise here, as much as we are against exercising here on Trifles. Although you may be out for a walk while you're listening to us, which is lovely, but while you do, stop and smell the roses. Maybe pick up that leaf that's on the ground, or certainly pick up after your dog while you're out there. And while you've stopped, hit that subscribe button. Make sure you get us on the regular. And maybe you'd even like to hit that support button where you can support us on Patreon or Substack. Whatever works for you, that works for us. Your support of the show allows us to do what we continue to do here. And if you have any questions about how to get there or where to go, simply go to SherlockHolmesPodcast.com and we've got everything you need right in one place. Man, I was just getting lulled into that nice violin music there and jarred awake by the sub dive.
Yes, well, the enemy will sneak up on you if you relax too much.
You never know. Well, Bert, we know that Watson, of course, was a military man, and I think that sets the stage for what we are going to talk about. I think we've identified 6 battles that we'd like to talk about. There are more, but these are the principal or trifling 6 that we've identified. So why don't you kick us off?
Bang! I'd love to kick us off. You know, the interesting thing about the battles is that when you have this conversation about the world of Sherlock Holmes and these battle references, a great starting point is to recognize that this is part of the daily conversation of these people. And these references, while they might seem, because of the passage of time, to be obscure to us, were desperately relevant and immediate to the audience, to Watson's readers. And look no further than the Battle of My Wand. When we first meet Watson, the very first page of A Study in Scarlet, he basically tells us that he'd been assigned to the 66th Regiment at My Wand. Now, for modern readers in the 21st century, that doesn't mean very much, except he was an army doctor. But no, I mean, and also when you think about the technology of the Victorian era, you could also say to yourself, well, you know, this kind of a battle far away from London, the news reports, these people were not getting daily updates on things that are going on around the world like we were. This is probably just a little reference to something. Well, no, that's not so. The war in Afghanistan and the Battle of Maiwan were not removed at all from the daily concerns of English citizens. And in fact, publications like the Illustrated London News and others reported the state of this war. This is the war in Afghanistan. And Maiwan was a huge disaster. It was the last stand of the 66th Regiment. So when Watson places himself there, it has an immediate impact on his readers. And that's why, his wound, his injuries, his feeling about that. And also we know from the history of Conan Doyle and work that John Lellenberg and Dan Stashower did, that the moment that Conan Doyle himself read about the results of the Battle of Maiwan were when he was returning back to civilization from his time as a doctor on an Arctic whaling ship, because Conan Doyle noted in his diary that they'd gone ashore and he'd found a newspaper and read about the Battle of Maiwan. What a disaster. And so that's why when he comes to write about Watson, he places him there, because years later he's still remembering the impact of that event.
Yeah, and the event took place on July 27th, 1880. So this was just about a year before the Sherlock Holmes stories kicked off. I mean, it was 7 years before the story hit publication in the Beaton's Christmas Annual. But as Watson tells us, and I think we actually had a Trifles episode where Edgar Smith looked at the timing of A Study in Scarlet, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, that was one of Edgar's earliest essays. I think, if I remember correctly, it was what he had written, and I think it may have been the first thing he sent to Christopher Morley by an example of his own Sherlockian writing.
Yeah, we did that in earlier this year, episode 385, "The Long Road from My Wand," and based on the troop transport and Watson's recuperation, etc., he dated A Study in Scarlet as occurring in 1882. Rather than the widely acclaimed 1881. Because as you hear, if that Battle of Maiwan took place at the end of July in 1880, it doesn't leave Watson an awful lot of time to recover, get to London, spend through his entire pension, etc. So that makes sense from that standpoint. But I mean, this was one of those brutal wars, almost like the Charge of the Light Brigade. There were almost 2,500 British and Indian troops against 25,000 Afghan warriors. And of those nearly 2,500 British troops, approximately 1,200 were killed. About half of them wiped out. That's astounding. It's a slaughter. So you point out, Bert, it being in the public's imagination and public's awareness, absolutely, and brutally so. So that's the opening. That's how we get to meet the damaged Watson. And just as a side point, non-canonically, if we want to think about the BBC revival in Sherlock in 2010, they did a wonderful job updating this, because guess what? There's still war going on in Afghanistan in 2010. And Watson, coming off as a soldier with PTSD, having been involved in some skirmishes and battles there, is a very realistic and believable update to this timeless tale. Why don't we move on to the Battle of Malplaquet?
Well, this is a battle that we hear about as an aside, and only a very attentive reader in the cases of Sherlock Holmes, which of course all you folks are, would have noticed it. It's in the Reigate Squires. And can you recall the exact way we hear about it? It's on a building, isn't it?
It is. This is kind of in the middle of the story, I believe, Watson says we passed the pretty cottage where the murdered man had lived, and walked up an oak-lined avenue to the fine old Queen Anne house, which bears the date of Malplaquet upon the lintel of the door.
Yeah, it's interesting. Malplaquet, this is a battle, European history and the balance of power in Europe is a recurring theme. Well, it's a recurring theme in history, and therefore it's a recurring theme in and out of the cases of Sherlock Holmes. When Holmes has his grand sojourn in Europe and he's believed to be dead, he's very much encountering lands as he travels that have to deal with British influence and trade and the empire. And here it's another example. This is the early 18th century. It's 1709. And this is the War of Spanish Succession. And, you would say to yourself, as a modern reader, so how is that, relevant to Queen Anne? Well, it was a great victory of the Duke of Marlborough. And what was going on here was, the influence of these various colonizing countries in Europe. And the issue was, where does the Spanish throne, the inheritance of the Spanish throne, because the ruler at the time dies childless, and where is the control of the great resources of Spain going to lie? And in one way or another, the Duke of Marlborough gets involved in this and has one of his great victories, but at a big cost. I think something like 20,000 men perished. But the Duke of Marlborough, who was a great figure in British history, won a victory there, and so it was memorialized in this early 18th century, 1709, early 1700s structure.
Yeah, and 1709. This is how the century began for France. The French state was bankrupt. The poor France had a really rough time in the 1700s. Began in bankruptcy, ended in revolution. There was widespread famine in the country from a really harsh winter, and a number of their garrisons around the country had all mutinied over lack of food and pay. And Louis XIV wanted to end the war and initiated peace talks with the Grand Alliance in The Hague. And he accepted most of their terms. The Grand Alliance included the Dutch Republic, Great Britain, the Holy Roman Empire, and Prussia. And he accepted most of their terms, replacing his grandson Philip V of Spain with the Habsburg candidate Archduke Charles. That's the principle for which they were ostensibly fighting. But he and his ministers couldn't agree to the demand that the French troops be used to remove Philip, and talks broke down in April, and the battle commenced. And as you say, it was about 86,000 on the Alliance's side and 75,000 on France's side, and 22,000 were lost on the Alliance, 11,000 from the French.
Isn't this a good point to stop and recognize how lucky we are to live in a world where there are no more of these conflicts in places like Afghanistan, and how well things are going in France, and how oh, wait a minute, maybe not maybe well, I can't do that.
Yeah, why don't we keep ourselves in France then?
Well, why don't we keep ourselves in France? I'll have garçon, another croissant, s'il vous plaît.
Oh, well, that gets us to Agincourt.
Oh, Agincourt. Well, that's Abbey Grange, where we have this, and of course there's no real reference to Agincourt in the world of Sherlock Holmes, except through Holmes's mouth, where he says, "The game's afoot."
That's
and of
right.
course, that is a reference to a great writer who commemorated that battle on the page.
Yeah, Henry V by William Shakespeare has this wonderful, famous, rousing speech, the St. Crispin's Day speech, which begins, "Once more unto the breach, dear friends, once more. Close the wall up with our English dead." And he goes on and on, encouraging his men to, find the courage and to unite in the battle as they move forward. He said, I see you stand like the greyhounds in the slips, straining upon the start. The game's afoot. Follow your spirit, and upon this charge cry, God for Harry, England, and St. George.
Doesn't sound, though, that the start of that with, what was that, fill up the wall with our English dead, is necessarily a good way to get into that message, but there you are.
No sense in shying away from the realism. There. But that was October 25th, 1415 in northern France. Of course, once again, England and France are at it. And it's about 6,000 to 8,000 men on the British side and 14,000 to 15,000 on the French side, or up to 25,000 if you're counting armed servants. About 600 killed on the British side and 6,000 killed on the French side. Rough stuff.
Rough stuff indeed. Well, from there we move on to really an interesting passage in the world of Sherlock Holmes in The Adventure of the Cardboard Box. And do you want to tell us a little bit about that scene, because it's a very memorable scene in Baker Street.
This is an opening that was repeated in The Resident Patient because the cardboard box was deemed too risque for publication in a book, in book format, in the memoirs of Sherlock Holmes. But it did appear first in the Strand magazine. And this is that blazing hot August day where Holmes and Watson are cooped up inside. And Holmes is observing Watson. Watson didn't realize it. He'd fallen into a brown study, he said, tossed aside the newspaper and leaned back in his chair. And Holmes said, "You're right, Watson. It does seem a most preposterous way of settling a dispute." And before he could realize what was going on, he said, "Most preposterous." And they sat up and stared at Holmes in blank amazement. "What is this, Holmes? This is beyond anything I could have imagined." And this is what's known in the Sherlockian world as the mind-reading incident. And Holmes mentions how he sees Watson's hand steal toward his old wound, and he looks from place to place on the walls of Baker Street and gets this introspective look and gives Watson the evidence as to why or how he could read his mind. And as part of that, he said, "Then I'll tell you, after throwing down your paper, which was the action which drew my attention to you, you sat for half a minute with a vacant expression. Then your eyes fixed themselves upon your newly framed picture of General Gordon. And I saw by the alteration of your face that a train of thought had been started. But it didn't lead very far. Your eyes flashed across to the unframed portrait of Henry Ward Beecher, which stands upon your books. You glanced up at the wall, and of course your meaning was obvious. You were thinking that if the portrait were framed, it would just cover that bare space and correspond with Gordon's picture there." So, General Gordon. Who is General Charles Gordon?
Well, he was a great general who perished in, a terrible defeat at Khartoum. He was under siege, and basically, just to cut to the chase here, unfortunately, he and his troops were under siege, and the rescue battalions did not arrive in time. And Gordon and his men had put up a valiant struggle, but perished. Which was a major sobering moment, and Gordon was revered as a hero for that sacrifice. But one of the things that's interesting in that scene, and which we don't normally pay any attention to, is that today it's very customary, particularly for young people, to put up in their bedrooms posters and things that have a great meaning for their enthusiasms. And here in the world of Sherlock Holmes in Baker Street, Watson has put up these two photographs, these two drawings of these two people, because they mean something to him, and because he gets a feeling of emotion and some satisfaction when he sees those images. And while we've talked about that and what's on the wall of Baker Street and what it refers to and all the details, what we've never mentioned, I think, is the why of it. It could just be a nice picture of a cat or a bull pup or a landscape. No, it's these people, and it tells you a lot about the people that matter to Watson and the issues and thinking that matter to Watson, that they're there.
And absolutely does. And I think, when we put this in context of Watson's return to England after the Battle of Maiwand, well, of course, he would have some sympathy for a military leader who was leading or trying to hold off, this siege. There were about 7,000 troops on the British side, and this occurred in the Sudan, in Africa. Egypt had conquered Sudan in 1820, but Egypt then came under British domination in 1882, and the Mahdists, Mahdist, began the war in 1881, and finally overtook the British and Egyptians in January of 1885. 30 to 50,000 Mahdist troops versus 7,000 British and Egyptian troops. So once again, an incredibly lopsided battle. And George W. Joy, an artist, portrayed General Gordon's death as he kind of stands at the top of the stairs as the rebels come and take him down. One has a spear ready to launch at him. It's just one of these heroisms of the day, the British military standing firmly, even though defeat is certain.
Well, I would just add two more things about that. I think that's very well said. The two things I would add are the words sacrifice and courage. And if you want to ask yourself, what would be in the mind of someone in the Victorian age in Baker Street, putting up that photo of Gordon, he really was a symbol of sacrifice and courage and dedication to the empire. And then the second thing I would say is that you have to remember the rooms at Baker Street were a shared space. So it's not like, Watson is going to put up a photograph of someone that Holmes is going to find abhorrent. In fact, Holmes is of the same mind. And so Gordon, is an important cultural figure that resonated not only to Watson, who was in military service and served in Afghanistan and saw the sacrifice and sacrificed himself, but also in Holmes's mind, who never served in the military. So I don't want to make too much of it, but I think it's just an important aspect of the environment.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. That shared space and that, common bond. Not to mention the bottle of Gordon's gin that was over on the sideboard. Well, all right. Let's round the corner here into the final two battles, which are related. They're both mentioned in the same phrase, and let's begin with Waterloo. So, we see Waterloo referenced across London, just in terms of locations and geography. The Waterloo Bridge, Waterloo Road, Waterloo Station, This, of course, was another great British victory over the French. It's the site of Napoleon's defeat. It's very famous. When someone says they've met their Waterloo, that means the jig is up. This is it. And the Duke of Wellington, of course, delivered the fatal blow to Napoleon's troops in March of 1815. June of 1815. So
yes, indeed. Well, it was a major turning point in European history. The British didn't do it all by themselves. It was the armies of the Duke of Wellington and General Blücher. Frau Blücher. The Duke of Wellington's army had the British, the Dutch, the Belgians, the German soldiers, and Blücher had 45,000 Prussians. And I'm sensitive to this because when I lived in Brussels, I lived very close to Waterloo. In fact, I lived the street that I lived on, which was kind of in the country, was the road that Blücher's forces came down to get to the scene of the battle, which is a major historic site today and enormous tourist interest there. But this is the end of the Napoleonic Wars. The French were defeated by this allied army. And after it, Napoleon had to abdicate as emperor and wound up on St. Helena. So this, was a major turning point in 1815, in June of 1815.
Yeah. And
of course we've got the six Napoleons. Napoleon, was a revered and commemorated figure for a variety of reasons by a large number of people. I mean, beside of his military activities, not many of which were not successful. It's a very bad time to go buy borscht in Moscow. But he instituted certain statutory reforms in France. Was a major figure, and so that's why there were 6 Napoleon statues that we had in that particular case, and so on.
Well, there you go, and here we get to the final battle, which is This is the battle that actually inspired us to come up with this episode in the first place, because of, once again, this phrase that also included Waterloo. Again, we return to the Abbey Grange, and Holmes and Watson have been out to the scene of the crime. Holmes is beginning to suspect that something is wrong with the lady's story. Lady Brackenstall, and he said, no, she was placed in that chair after the death of her husband. I'll wager that the black dress shows a corresponding mark to this. We have not yet met our Waterloo, Watson, but this is our Marengo. It begins in defeat and ends in victory.
Now that is really a very sophisticated reference by Sherlock Holmes. And again, it tells you how top of mind. I mean, the Battle of Marengo is from 1800, and Napoleon is not yet emperor of France, but he is the first consul. And so they are fighting in Italy, French forces led by Napoleon and Austrian forces near, I think, Piedmont in Italy. And as just to sort of, again, cut to the chase here, Holmes's description of it in a sentence is beautifully apt. It began in defeat, it ended in victory for Napoleon. And we have not yet met our Waterloo, because Waterloo was 15 years in the future.
Yeah, there you go. But it looked like it was a certain defeat for Napoleon. He crossed the Alps. And it was in mid-May of 1800, almost before the passes were open. And let's be clear, everyone knows that famous Jacques-Louis David piece of Napoleon crossing the Alps on his steed that's rearing and his robes are flowing in the wind. Well, he actually crossed on a mule. It was anything but heroic. It was tough going work, and Napoleon really wanted this victory. So he managed to get through the Alps and put one over on his enemies there. And it was again, it was the French against the Habsburgs. About 22,000 on the French side, about 30,000 on the Habsburg side. So slight upper hand there for the Habsburgs. But the French lost 1,100 killed, 3,600 wounded. The Habsburgs lost 6,000 that were killed or wounded and 8,000 captured. So Napoleon ended up with the upper hand on that at the end of the day.
Now, am I right in remembering that General Brigadier Girard had an early ancestor? I think it was an uncle, Pierre Girard, who served on Napoleon's forces at the Battle of Marengo, and who was a deserter. And it was after him that they commemorated the dish of chicken Marengo. Is that correct? Am I remembering that correctly?
It may be a little sketchy on how you got there, but you make a good point.
Do I? Well, that's a mistake.
Well,
that's a complete accident.
We would do ourselves a disservice, friends, if we did not leave you with Napoleon's dinner. That's right, a chicken Marengo recipe. In addition to links to more about each one of these 6 battles, we also have a wonderful chicken Marengo recipe for you in the show notes. It's just it's a one-pan chicken dish, and you've got savory chicken simmered in tomato sauce and made usually with tomatoes, mushrooms, white wine, chicken broth, onion, garlic. Wonderful, hearty dish. Whether you're braving the cold of the oncoming winter or you're in the middle of June and a starving member of Napoleon's troops.
Yeah, no, I think if I remember the history of this, the fact is that the chef in the army didn't have butter, and so it's basically fried chicken in olive oil with tomatoes and onions. And then they had other things that in modern recipes, like eggs and crayfish, that are not really added today, if I remember correctly. But who knows, And then today, I think sometimes you have it with pasta or noodles and things.
Yeah, well, I think it's one of those things that can be paired with just about anything because it's fresh ingredients and like the chefs of the time in these battles, they grabbed whatever ingredients were at hand.
Well, there you go.
Yeah. Whether you're battling people out in the fields or battling a chicken in your kitchen. All of this is just a trifle.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Please join us again next week for another installment of Trifles. Show notes are available on SherlockHolmesPodcast.com. Please subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and be sure to check out our longer show, I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, where we interview notable Sherlockians and share news of the Sherlockian world.
You've taken my breath away, Mr. Holmes.
I then moved to Persia and paid a short but interesting visit to the Khalifa in Khartoum, the results of which I passed on to Lord Kitchener and the Foreign Office, anonymously, of course.
You mean you actually saw the palace where Gordon was murdered?
It was a sorry sight, a ruin. His blood still upon the staircase.